Hello, diversity class. How are you? We're up on a Easter night for a lecture material. One of two lectures that will be uploaded this week. Today's lecture is brought to you by the city of New York City. New York City. This is a mug that I got in December of 1984 when I went for New Year's Eve, 84, 85. In the old days when you could still graffiti the subway trains. This is in honor of the now tens of thousands of people who have passed away in New York City from the virus. And they're doing amazing work there to shut it down. New York, we want you back, because I need to go ride a subway soon. All right, now we got the caffeine going. We can start the lecture. We're talking about the historical roots of bias. So I kind of teed this up at our last Zoom conversation of talking about the historical roots of bias and trying to find a starting place and talking about starting places, but not talking about ending places, that these things don't end. And so when we talk about it from the perspective that we've been kind of getting into, is the notion of where do we start talking about the beginning point of bias or the beginning point of historical bigotry. When does something start? And of course, you could make the argument that it's been there since the beginning of time, which is my least favorite thing, the beginning of time. Time has no beginning. But the notion of bigotry, the way we think about it, and the way we're sort of been defining in this class, has its root in dichotomizing, in creating a kind of us versus them binary. The idea of creating categories of people. And we can think about starting points where certain biases begin. That's the theme of this lecture. But as I mentioned before, there's no real end point as long as we're still locked into this kind of binary thinking. You can't say, well, racism ended or homophobia ended when Will and Grace came on TV. That was the end of it. There's been no more homophobia ever since. There's been no more sexism in England since they elected a female prime minister in 1979. It's locked into this sort of binary dichotomizing. But we can start a discussion about kind of the beginnings of these to understand the long history, how far back we go, and how the cumulative trauma associated, which is our next topic, builds and builds and builds. So we're going to just run through 5 or 6 biases, just as an example in this exercise of finding starting points. So let's start with the big one, sexism. There is a myth that sexism is the natural order, that because men have more upper body strength, I feel like I'm atrophying here, that because we have more upper body strength, we are therefore dominant, the dominant sex, women are the weaker sex, and therefore we have all the goodies come to us first. In fact, when anthropologists look at the world, and count cultures, from big cultures like the United States and small cultures like tribal cultures in the South Pacific. When they count cultures, they find that patriarchal societies where there's a natural advantage to maleness, are not cultural universals. Patriarchy is not a cultural universal. It's not all over the world. Anthropologists count it in about 80%. So the majority of cultures are patriarchal, but 20% are not, and the 20% that are not matriarchies. They aren't Wonder Woman Island or whatever that was, just Paradise Island. They are partnership societies. They are societies where men and women share power equally. Very common in the Pacific. We just rewatched last night Moana, which is a big favorite in this house. Don't get me singing. Shiny. And there are some goddess themes in that South Pacific story, which is rooted on kind of an old folk tale in the South Pacific. And so when we talk about the starting point of this, where did this begin? Because not only is patriarchy not a cultural universal, it's also not a universal through time. This notion that cavemen beat cave women with their cave clubs and drag them back to the cave. Is also a myth. Hunting and gathering societies were mostly gathering, which was equally male and female work. Even the evidence we have on the historical record of hunting is there were plenty of women hunting. So this notion that men have always been dominated is just a lot of BS. There's sort of this myth. So the question then is, how did we shift from what were primarily partnership societies where men and women shared power equally, and there was no power dynamic, there was no institutionalized sexism, to one where there was a lot of institutionalized sexism. You know, I mean, we could just take the Catholic Church as an example of institutionalized sexism, right? The Pope is the patriarch, literally. Well, the shift, you know, there's a great theory, and there's a wonderful book that I have my students read. I just happen to have here, because my 204 students are reading it this quarter, The Chalice and the Blade. And it's about kind of the origin of patriarchy, where we get this idea, and where we get the idea has to do, and how we shift from female goddesses to male gods. And the female goddesses were the life givers. They created life like women created life. So obviously God was female, because man can't create life. And they were settled into the land, the Fertile Crescent. Do you know about that? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. That's the Tigris and Euphrates, what is now Iraq. The beginning of civilization, settling and growing the land. So the fertile womb of the earth, the fertile womb of the woman, all tied together, all tied into the sacred feminine. And then what Eisler posits in something that she calls the cultural transformation theory, that there were these nomadic tribes that weren't settled, that had to be warriors. Nomads had to be able to invade other lands and take the people and kill them and take their stuff. So there was a lot of destruction, not creation, that's the role of the goddess, but destruction. The chalice is the womb of the womb, you know, where babies are born. Maybe you know about that. And the blade is sort of the phallic destroyer. Women are the creators, men are the destroyers. And so what the cultural transformation theory argues, that around 8,000 years ago, there were waves of invasions in places like Crete and ancient Greece and ancient Turkey that saw the invasion of these male-worshipping nomadic tribes invading the relatively peaceful and groovy goddess-worshipping cultures, and they started rewriting their myths and their religions and replacing the goddess with the god, and that's given us another sort of 8,000 years of patriarchal rule. Her argument is, you know, it's good back then. We can have it in the future. We can return to partnership societies. I mean, she wrote that book in 1987 when the world was on the brink of nuclear annihilation. So she was like, we need to figure this thing out and get away from the rule of the blade and get back to the chalice, and get away from patriarchal rule. And there's been a lot of discussion about that just recently. So I have talked about, and I'll include a link here. I had a wonderful conversation about a year and a half ago with Gloria Steinem, who's one of the founding mothers of American feminism. It was right after the Trump thing, and I asked her, I said, you know, how do you, as a feminist and as a thinker who's got sort of a long view of this history, how do you make sense of this whole Trump thing? And she said, Randy, she used my name. She said, when a woman who's battered by her husband is most at risk of being murdered by this abuser is when she's trying to escape him. When she's trying to flee the man who beats her on a regular basis. That's when he's most likely to go that extra length and kill her. She said that's where America is right now. We are trying to flee, that's the word. We are trying to flee our abuser, and he may either kill us, that's, you know, the sort of the Trump right-wing thing, or we may break free and go into a new world. I don't know if we're going to break free with Joe Biden. That seems a little, but that the idea is that, you know, we're at this turning point now where patriarchy is really strangling the hopes of equality. So starting point having to do with the shift from female goddess to male god. Remember all this because we do have a midterm in this class. So that's just a really brief idea there, that starts a long historical process of devaluing the feminine, right? Feminine women are girls. We use the feminism put down, hey ladies. Think about the way the boys bully other boys, they feminize them. Okay, so that's a little bit of a historical point, 8,000 years ago. What about homophobia? You know, an anti-homosexual attitude. Well, social scientists will tell you that sexuality is fluid. Wink, wink, as my daughter would say. that people are just sexual beings, and we sort of, understand that men and women have to get together to make babies, but we'll pretty much go with whoever's available. I mean, that's sort of the message of human sexuality over, the long history that we've recorded, all the knocking boots that we've been doing, even in the days before there were actual boots, when we were just knocking toes, I guess. But there is a tribal mandate. When we're thinking about tribal societies, especially if you think about sort of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern-based tribes 10,000 years ago, there was a tribal mandate that you need people in your tribe. The more people you have in your tribe, the stronger your tribe will be. First of all, there's a high infant mortality rate, so there's a lot of babies that don't make it. There's all kinds of things that take you out of the picture. You're being devoured by animals. And also, you got to go to war with the tribe on the other side of the valley. So you need more warriors. You need more people to be able to withstand their attacks and be able to attack them. So be fruitful and multiply. That becomes a kind of motto in every tribal society. So you want to reinforce reproductive behavior, heterosexual reproductive behavior. You want to reinforce people having sex to produce babies. You want to, therefore, discourage non-reproductive sexual behavior, including same-sex sex, which, of course, in those days is men, right? Because the idea of women having sex, for the most part, with each other wasn't, in a patriarchal setting anyway, wasn't very threatening. So you wanted to discourage men from having sex with men, and you wanted to encourage them to have sex with women to produce more babies and more people for your tribe. So therefore, there is a mandate. And there's no defining of homosexual in the ancient text, whether it's the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. It just says a man shall not lie with a man as he would with a woman, meaning, getting intimate like that. And so there is a kind of long-standing religious designation that says we prefer heterosexual behavior over same-sex behavior because we want babies. We need more babies. The term homosexual isn't coined until the year 1896. A Hungarian doctor came up with it because he wanted to find a way of criminalizing men having sex with each other. So when people say it's in the Bible, it's not in the Bible. They just want people to be fruitful or multiply, and they want to discourage them from not doing that. So again, a historical origin of that particular bias going way back. And once you put some version of it in a sacred text, people would say, well, God wants, just think of the Westboro Baptist Church folks that say, they have signs that say God hates fags, like they think they're speaking for God. And I think any sort of sane thinking Christian would know that is nowhere to be seen in the Bible. They just sort of make it up. They put 2 and 2 together and get 17. So there's that. Racism. Racism is a big one. And racism, D'Angelo talks about racism, and we talked about this, I think, before, as a form of prejudice, but it's more than prejudice. It's a particular type of prejudice that sees a group of people defined by physical characteristics, what we would socially construct as a race, as somehow inferior, as less than. And people will say, well, we've always done that. Always, the tribe over there, they were a bunch of cockroaches. And yeah, but that's different. We're talking about a systemic, remember racism is systemic, a systemic redefinition of people as less than human. So we do actually have a date on this, and some folks might remember this lecture from my intro class. The date is June 18th, 1452. What happened on June 18th, 1452? Well, the Catholic Church, was kind of running the show, and there has been a long history of slavery throughout human existence. And for the most part, humans have enslaved other people by capturing them in war. And it could be Native Americans, and the Native Americans in this part of Oregon had slaves long before white people ever showed up. They would, battle another tribe, and they would capture people, and they would make them do the dishes or do the laundry, or sometimes go kill other people. The Romans were famous for this. They were enslaving people all over the place. This was a little bit different because this was in the period of the Crusades. So the Catholic Church was launching these assaults, mostly on the Muslim Middle East and Africa. And yeah, you could capture those people and enslave them. It was expensive. It was expensive. Those Crusades, took a lot of energy. A lot of people didn't come back, and, But that was the only legitimate way to get a slave. There's a little story here that sort of makes this a little bit more challenging. The story is one of the founding stories in Judeo-Christianity, which is the story of Moses. If you know Moses, used to be on Easter evening, they would always show the Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston as Moses. Let my people go, and he parted the Red Sea. It was an amazing, cool movie effect, and we were all amazed. It was before CGI, so I think they actually parted the Red Sea. Moses is famous for freeing the slaves of Israel, right? He freed the Hebrews from the Pharaoh, who were forcing the Jewish people, the Hebrew tribe, to build these temples to, their gods and their rulers. And Moses did a little trick. God, said, hey, let's get these people out of here. And he freed the slaves of Israel, and they went on an exodus to try to find their homeland. And it took them a few, millennia, and then they ended up in Israel in 1948. Yep. Took a little bit. One of the founding patriarchs of the Christian faith, of the Judeo-Christian faith, is a guy who freed the slaves. So therefore, it makes it kind of hard to enslave other people, just enslave them the way the Pharaoh enslaved the Hebrews, right? Well, what was happening in 1452 is there was a need for cheap labor, and these crusades were just not paying off at producing slaves for the cheap labor as the world was expanding, and people were starting to harvest the grain, and you really needed more cheap labor. So these Portuguese traders went to the Pope, and the Pope, his name was Pope Nicholas V, Pope Nicholas V, Nick V, as I like to call him. I said, man, we need some help. Can you help us out? And so he got together with his brain trust, and they figured out that since the Pope, speaks for God, they could do a little trick. They could declare that the people of the Middle East and of Africa, and especially of North Africa, and especially the Muslims of North Africa, if they could declare that the Africans were no longer people, if Africans were no longer people, you could rationalize slavery. That on that date in 1452, he sent out something called the Dum Dervasis, which basically declared that the pagans and the heathens and the Muslims of Africa were no longer people. They were soulless beasts of the field, and therefore you could go capture them like you would go capture a horse or some animal that you wanted to domesticate. Since they didn't have souls, you really didn't have anything to worry about. So you weren't the Pharaoh, because it would be hugely hypocritical for Christians to go enslave other people who lived in Africa, because that makes you the Pharaoh, and then they're going to have a Moses, a black Moses, like Isaac Hayes. It's an ancient soul music reference. Then you're the bad guy. Like, how hypocritical would that be? But if the people of Africa were not people, no harm, no foul. You just go get them, And so that started this diaspora of African slavery, of Africans being kidnapped and stolen and tortured and murdered and raped and everything because they weren't people. And the key here to what the Pope pulled off was this concept of dehumanization. If you can take people who are human beings and declassify them as less than humans, then you can do whatever you want. And that notion of dehumanization was so successful, starting in the 15th century, that it was extended to other categories of people. We dehumanize women, we dehumanize gay people, we dehumanize the Irish for a couple hundred years. I mean, it just becomes a technique of dichotomizing. Dehumanization is a tool of dichotomizing. The us versus them is us humans and those people who are almost human but not quite, and therefore we don't have to feel bad about abusing them. So that's a really quick version of 500, 600 years of racist abuse and objectification and oppression and dehumanization and the worst of the worst and the Holocaust times 1,000 that is rooted in that very simple notion of dehumanization that all kind of officially became encoded in the structure of society on June 18th, 1452. Okay. Back to that one for sure. We'll definitely go back to that one. Okay, modern anti-Semitism. I say modern anti-Semitism because the Jewish people have a long history of being abused and being targeted that goes way back, right, way back. But we're talking about modern anti-Semitism, the belief that the Jews are somehow inherently evil. There's something about them that is dark and nefarious, and that there is a global conspiracy of Jews that run the world. And we talked about this a little bit on our last Zoom meeting. Where did that wasn't around in the days of the Pharaoh. Let me tell you, that is a modern invention, and where we really start to see that take hold is during the French Revolution. So we had the American Revolution, 1776, and it starts a little bit there, but really during the French Revolution, because these revolutions, these democratic revolutions that were starting to happen thanks to the Enlightenment, were about overthrowing the divine right of kings, the divine right of kings and queens, right? Let's get those people out. Let's get King George out, or King Louis Philippe out, or let's, the Catholic Church or the Church of England that props up these monarchs, let's get rid of them and establish a democracy. Well, when you go against the church, there's going to be some people that are pissed off, right? They love their church and their church's power and their church's authority structure. Who must be behind these revolutions? Who must be behind these democratic revolutions? Well, in France, since the revolution was against the Catholic Church, theories started to emerge that the Jacobins and the kind of revolutionaries fueling the French Revolution didn't care about democracy and liberty, fraternity, and equality, right? That's the French motto. They cared about destroying the Catholic Church. And so who would be behind that? This conspiracy theory about a global Jewish cabal, global Jewish conspiracy, emerged during the French Revolution in the late 1700s. That the Jews were behind this. And then, that spread in the early 20th century. That was used against the Russian Revolution, that the Bolsheviks must be a bunch of Jews that want to destroy the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Church and the rule of czars. And World War I. World War I was seen as a grand Jewish conspiracy. And this theory just grew and grew and grew, partially because of a doctored document that was a total fake called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion that you can read online. And basically it's the proof that the Jews run the world. And it was taken from Napoleon speeches. And it was just sort of this manufactured thing. It was like about as legitimate as a Wikipedia page. And so this theory was widespread, including in America in the early 20th century, a guy named Henry Ford. If you know what Ford Auto, right, Ford trucks, that Ford, the guy who was the American industrialist who brought the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing to America, was a virulent anti-Semite, a believer in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, wrote a pamphlet called The International Jew that was about how the Jews run the banks of the world. And Hitler, in Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, his sort of autobiography, he favorably talks about Henry Ford. He wanted Henry Ford to be the president so he didn't have to go to war against the United States, and Germany and U.S. could be Nazi allies in anti-Semitic fascism. And so that, those theories about the Jewish people have persisted, and they're with us to this day. The incredible amount of internet garbage that says that COVID-19 and the coronavirus are a Jewish plot to take away our rights and establish a Zionist type of socialist system. You can imagine what these people say about Bernie Sanders. So those conspiracy theories, though, really have an origin in the French Revolution and the movement away from the divine right of kings. Xenophobia, the fear of immigrants. Well, this one also has a long history in this country. Since it seems a little odd, since we are a nation of immigrants, we all come from, unless you're a Native American person, you're an indigenous person, you are the child of immigrants if you aren't an immigrant yourself. The root of this in the United States is in the notion of what it means to be an American. And so what it means to be an American, the culturally dominant group that is there at the kind of defining of the notion of the American, is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So these are, what Anglo-Saxon means Northern European, right? So these are Germans and Dutch and English and Scandinavian people who are coming to colonize this country. French a little bit. French aren't really that Protestant, a little bit more Catholic. So when that becomes the norm, then when other people who aren't WASP, including the Irish, including Italians, right? All these sort of Catholics start coming who are less are seen as the other. Remember we talked about othering, are seen as the othering. And so when the waves of immigration become more non-waspish, I don't know if that's a term, but less white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, then you see the rise of xenophobia, especially in the late 1800s in this country, where there becomes real bias against sort of two groups, the Irish and, also Catholics from Italy and Eastern Europe a little bit, but the Irish, Catholic, and also the Chinese who were the labor that were brought here to help build the railroads. All of a sudden, there's an incredible amount of violence targeting Chinese, especially here in Oregon. Just look up Chinese Massacre Cove. I mean, it's a pretty brutal mass murder of people just because they were Chinese, because of the xenophobia there. So the root of xenophobia, and this is super brief, right? The root of xenophobia in America is when the immigration patterns shift away from WASPs, away from white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Then we start getting this notion, hey, we were here first, this is our country, you're different from us, you're the other, and therefore we're going to discriminate against you. And lastly, I wanted to mention ableism. People who are differently able, this could be mental disabilities, this could be physical disabilities, and this is an interesting one because there is a medieval notion. In many cultures around the world, if you're differently abled, you have a special quality. You might be closer to God. There are tribes in Africa that would diagnose what we would call schizophrenia as a divine intervention. The people are hearing voices. We need to listen to what they're saying, because in the old days they called those people prophets. Now we call them schizophrenics. Sorry, Mormons and Muslims and, everybody that's got a prophet. Like, if those folks around now, like God told me, they'd probably be diagnosed. So in many cultures, disabilities were seen as special abilities. They weren't devalued. But starting in the Middle Ages, there starts to be a notion when the Catholic Church, again, is sort of running things, that somebody with a physical or mental disability has the devil in them. There's some type of demonic possession or some type of thing that crippled their body or made their body different from the rest of ours. And so there was a real religious lens that saw disability as evil, starting kind of in what we'd call the Dark Ages, when the Catholic Church really started to rule things. In the 1800s, as we became more scientific and the Enlightenment values started to take hold, disability began to be seen as difference from the norm. That scientists would establish what the norm is, what the mental norm is, how you think and see and interact with the world, and the physical norm, what the body is supposed to look like and act like. And anything that deviated from that was defined as a disability, and therefore some type of defect, right? Defect meaning there's something wrong with you, a birth defect. And so therefore you are somehow less than. And the challenge from that perspective is how to either make them more like you, right? This is the cochlear implant thing, to make deaf people normal. And a lot of deaf people are like, why are you trying to make us like you? Leave us alone, we're fine as we are. Or to warehouse you, to move you away so we don't have to see your abnormality. And so there is a root of ableism in defining what is normal. I have to do these air quotes, and what is not normal. And in fact, we're all abnormal. Hello, I'm abnormal. There is really, a social construction process in defining what's normal. So, but they're, rooted in these sort of pseudoscientific theories. Okay, so the question that I want to kind of posit that maybe that we could get at in our Zoom discussion is, we've got these 6 isms, these 6 bigotries. Why do they seem to kind of become more intense at times? So, for example, hate crimes. Like, hate crimes, can all of a sudden, start to go up. The last few years, we've seen a spike in hate crimes. The last 2 months, we've seen a spike in hate crimes targeting Asian Americans. One of the explanations for this is what happens when we get change. So there is a sociological concept, and I know some of you know, the term is anomie. Comes from Emile Durkheim, 1897, anomie, meaning the sense of normlessness. And he talked about the sense of normlessness a lot in discussing why people committed suicide, right? When people felt like they didn't have something to plug into. For example, Protestants had a higher suicide rate than Catholics, because Catholics have all these rituals that kind of keep them connected. Catholics are sort of, okay, the Stations of the Cross, genuflecting and going to confession and midnight mass, and you'll be okay. Protestants, there's the Bible, go figure it out. And you're like jumping off a cliff. But also a lot of anomie can happen when there's rapid change. When Europe is shifting from an agrarian society to an industrial society, or a rural society to an urban society, or a monarchy to a democracy, right? There's all this change that's sort of happening all of a sudden, and there's a sense of normlessness, and therefore people were a little bit freaked out. And so what we know now, and having, over 100 years of studying this notion of anomie, when people are experiencing anomie, when there's a lot of change going on, they want to go back. They want to go back to a mythical time in the past when there was less anomie, when everything made sense, when we didn't have to worry about what pronoun to use, and transgender bathrooms, and not saying the wrong thing and being called a racist, and the good old days, we didn't have to worry about sexual harassing, and there was no hashtag Me Too. Like, they want to go back to the sort of notion that there was a time when there was not anomie, and that can drive a lot of this bigotry, this notion of the sense of normlessness. So the whole Make America Great Again is a response to anomie, is a response to all the change, and the idea of going back to, again, when was America last great? America has always been great and always been screwed up. It's great now and it's screwed up now. It's always shades of gray and complexities and blah, blah, blah. But when people experience anomie, they want to go back in time. So I want us to have a little bit of a conversation about what drives the movement against honoring diversity that is rooted in this notion of anomie and this idea that things are changing too fast and we want to go back somewhere. So I'll just leave that as a thought bubble. And then I will come back very soon with a video about trauma, the pyramid of hate, and the concept of microaggression. So that's a whole bunch that's coming your way. All right, there you go. That's it for tonight. Happy whatever you celebrate. Estra, the goddess of fertility. That's who they named Easter after. All right, peace out.